There are places on this earth that don't just scare you, they consume you. Not with monsters or ghosts, but with a slow, patient hunger that turns ordinary moments into the opening lines of a nightmare you'll spend the rest of your life trying to forget. I'm talking about true accounts from people who walked into the wrong silence, the wrong stretch of road, the wrong creak of a floorboard, and walked out changed in ways doctors can't explain. Tonight, you'll hear 3 stories that don't rely on cheap shocks. They rely on something far worse: the truth. First, a Canadian wilderness trip that turned into a haunting that wore a familiar face. Pulling a grieving brother into a valley that knows how to echo. Then, an Australian couple on the long, empty Nullarbor who discovered that the road wasn't just long, it was a loop, and something on it was getting closer every time they passed. And finally, an artist in a remote Cornwall cottage who found a room that shouldn't exist, a room that was dreaming about her long before she arrived. Real names, real places, real events. Only the identities have been changed because the survivors are still living, still looking over their shoulders, still waking up in cold sweat. If you've ever felt like a place was watching you, if you've ever caught a whisper that wasn't the wind, stay with me. By the end of this, you'll understand why some locations keep their secrets buried in dread, and why sometimes the scariest sound isn't a scream, it's silence. If true horror gets your heart racing, hit that like button, like your life depends on it. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story, and comment right now. What's scarier? The wilderness, an endless road, or an old house? I read every single one, and your story might be next. Ellis Vance hadn't spoken his brother's name aloud in 2 years. Not since the funeral where their mother had pressed a small, flat stone from the Nahanni River into his palm and whispered, "He would have wanted you to finish it." And now here he was, paddling a solo canoe through the milky green water of the South Nahanni. The stone heavy in his pocket, like a promise he couldn't keep. The first day was almost unbearably beautiful, sheer canyon walls rising out of the mist like the spines of ancient animals. The roar of Virginia Falls growing from a rumble to a thunder that shook his ribs, but by the second afternoon, the silence had shifted, becoming a listening silence. The kind that makes your ears ring and your scalp tighten because the world sounds like it's holding its breath. Ellis camped on a gravel bar near a bend the locals called Devil's Throat. An undercut in the limestone where the water spiraled into itself and disappeared with a sound like a throat swallowing. And as he gathered driftwood for a fire, he caught a sound that made his hands stop mid-motion. His name, spoken in a voice he knew better than his own heartbeat. A voice that had been silent since a rock fall in the Rockies had taken Liam 3 summers ago. Ellis. It curled out of the canyon like smoke, thin and stretched. And every instinct told him it was a trick of the wind, except the wind didn't shape syllables, didn't inject that familiar lilt that Liam always had when he was about to say something funny, didn't leave a silence afterward that felt like a mouth waiting for an answer. So he shouted Liam's name back into the darkening gorge, his voice cracking, and the echo that returned wasn't his own. It was laughter. Light and warm and utterly wrong. And then a splash from downstream, as if someone had just slipped into the water. Ellis grabbed his headlamp and stumbled along the bank, rocks shifting under his boots, the beam catching nothing but the churn of white water until it landed on a figure standing knee-deep in the river. Back turned, the silhouette unmistakably his brother's, the same broad shoulders, the same tilt of the head, the same red flannel shirt Liam had been wearing the day he died. The figure turned slowly, and Ellis's light illuminated a face that was Liam's but not. The features slightly too sharp, the mouth a fraction too wide, the eyes reflecting the headlamp with a flat, colorless gleam like polished stones, and when it spoke, the sound came from everywhere and nowhere. Perfect copy of Liam's voice saying, "I've been waiting, Al. Why did you take so long?" Ellis's legs unlocked and he ran, not toward the canoe but into the bush. Branches whipping his face, the laughter following him not from behind, but from inside his own head, bouncing around his skull like a rock in a tin can. And he didn't stop until he crashed through a screen of willows and fell into a clearing where the ground was soft and black and smelled of rot. He lay there gasping, the laughter fading, and when he finally sat up, his headlamp showed him that the clearing was ringed with stones arranged in patterns that weren't natural spirals, in shapes that seemed to move when he looked at them directly, and in the center, half buried, was a canoe exactly like his own, splintered and ancient with a name carved into the gunwale, Ellis. He didn't sleep that night. He built the biggest fire he could and sat with his back to a rock, the carved stone from his mother clutched in his fist. And every hour or so, the voice would drift out of the canyon. Sometimes his name, sometimes fragments of a conversation they'd had when they were kids. Sometimes just breathing, wet and close, as if the thing had crawled out of the water and was standing just beyond the firelight, patient as eternity. At first light, he shoved the canoe into the current and paddled without stopping for 14 hours. The river carrying him past Deadman Valley and the gate, and he didn't let himself look back until he reached the float plane pickup at Lineberg Landing. It was only when he was in the air, the Nahani shrinking to a silver thread beneath him, that he pulled out his phone to check the photos he'd taken on the first day and found a dozen images he hadn't shot, all taken at 3:02 a.m., all showing the same thing, his own sleeping face, close up, with a pale grinning shape reflected in the tent fabric behind him. Ellis deleted the photos, threw the phone in the trash at the Yellowknife airport, and hasn't been within 100 kilometers of a river since. But he told me that sometimes, when he's just about to fall asleep, he hears his brother's voice say, almost a single word, close and warm, a hand on his shoulder, and he knows that whatever lives in Devil's Throat hasn't forgotten him, and is still hungry for the brother who got away. The Nullarbor isn't just empty, it's a kind of emptiness that gets inside you. An ocean of red dirt and saltbush, where the horizon is a blinding white. Line and the highway is so straight, you can drive for hours without touching the wheel. And that's what Matilda Benson and her partner Darcy Keene were counting on when they set out from Seduna in their old Land Cruiser, aiming to cross the plain in 2 days and catch the sunrise over the Great Australian Bight. They were 3 hours in. The road a shimmering ribbon under a sun that seemed to be melting the sky, when Darcy pointed out the kangaroo, a huge red buck lying on the shoulder, its body intact, but its eyes gone, pecked clean by crows. Until he felt a shiver, because the carcass looked fresh, but the crows were nowhere in sight, as if they'd fled in a hurry. They didn't stop, just kept driving. The radio a hiss of static, because there was nothing out here to broadcast. Oh, nothing. Except the occasional road train and the endless hypnotic thrum of the tires. An hour later, they saw the same kangaroo, same position, same missing eyes, same patch of dried blood on the asphalt that Darcy swore they'd passed already. Until he laughed it off because all dead roos looked the same, didn't they? But then they passed it a third time, and this time there was something new. A figure standing beside the carcass, a person in a broad-brimmed hat and a long coat despite the heat. Completely still, Not waving, not hitchhiking, just watching. Darcy slowed down, but Tilly grabbed his arm, a cold spike of fear punching through her chest because the figure's posture was wrong. The arms slightly too long, the head tilted at an angle that looked broken. And as they passed it, the figure's head didn't turn to follow them. It swiveled, a smooth mechanical motion like a camera on a gimbal. And she caught a glimpse of a face that was featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank oval of sun-browned skin. Darcy floored it, the old diesel roaring, and the road stretched on into a heat haze that seemed to be thickening, turning the world into a bowl of white light, until he checked the GPS only to find the screen frozen on the same coordinates they'd had an hour ago. The little arrow not moving, the satellite signal dead. They drove in silence for what felt like an eternity, the fuel gauge dropping faster than it should. And the landscape began to repeat. Not just the kangaroo, but the same twisted salt bush, the same cracked culvert, the same abandoned car with its hood up. And its paint bleached to bone, and each time they passed, the figure was closer to the road, first standing on the shoulder, then on the white line, then in the middle of the lane, and now it was holding something. A sign with letters painted in what looked like dried blood turned back. Darcy swerved around it, tires squealing, and in the rearview mirror the figure was still there, still holding the sign, but its head was now turned 180 degrees to face them as they drove away. And Tilly screamed because the blank face had split open, a wet red gash appearing where a mouth should be, and a sound came out of it that cut through the engine noise. A long, low moan that wasn't a warning but an invitation, a call to stop and join whatever was waiting on the other side of the plain. The sun was setting now, the sky bleeding into purple, and the road looped back to the kangaroo for what had to be the 20th time, the carcass now bloated and splitting. And beside it, the figure was gone, replaced by their own Land Cruiser. Identical in every detail except the windshield was shattered and the driver's door was hanging open. And behind the wheel was a shape that was wearing Darcy's clothes, Darcy's hat, Darcy's face. But the eyes were gone, pecked clean, and the mouth was moving, speaking words that Tilly couldn't hear but could feel in her teeth, vibration that said, "You're already here. You've always been here. The loop doesn't end because you're part of it now." Darcy, panicking, wrenched the wheel hard right and drove off the highway onto the bare dirt. The Land Cruiser bucking over stones and spinifex, and they didn't stop until the engine seized and the radiator blew. Steam hissing into the night air, and they sat there in the sudden silence, breathing ragged, while the stars wheeled overhead in patterns that didn't match any sky Tilly had ever seen. They walked at dawn, leaving the vehicle behind, and found the highway after 2 hours, a road train stopping to pick them up. The driver, looking at them like they were ghosts, told them they were 70 kilometers from where they'd started, that the Nullarbor didn't loop, that maybe the sun had got to them. But when they climbed into the cab, Tilly looked back and saw the Land Cruiser they'd abandoned sitting by the roadside. Its windshield suddenly shattered, its driver's door hanging open, and in the seat a shape that was too still. They made it to Perth, sold the car, never spoke of the trip except in whispers. But Tilly told me that every road they've driven since, no matter how short, feels like a circle. And sometimes when the GPS flickers, she sees the same frozen coordinates and hears that low, waiting moan. And she knows the Nullarbor is still out there, still looping, still keeping its own version of them trapped on a stretch of road that doesn't exist on any map. Carys Llewellyn had rented the cottage on the Lizard Peninsula because it was cheap and because the listing photos showed a window seat overlooking a churning Atlantic that looked like it had been painted in shades of gray and fury. And she'd told herself that 6 months of isolation was exactly what she needed to finish the series of coastal paintings that had been stalling in her London studio. The cottage was called Eglwysithen, a Cornish word the owner translated as little church, and it was built into the side of a cliff so that the back wall was living rock, damp to the touch, and studded with tiny white crystals that glittered when the firelight hit them. The first thing Carys noticed, after she'd unpacked her brushes and set up her easel, was the salt of fine. A white film that appeared on every surface overnight, no matter how often she wiped it away, a crust that tasted of tears and left her lips cracked and stinging. And then there were the drawings. She found the first one slipped under the pantry door on her 4th morning, a child's sketch, done in crayon, showing a stick figure with long yellow hair standing at the edge of a cliff, arms outstretched, with a wave curling over it like a hand. The figure had 2 big blue dots for eyes, and a smile that was drawn with such pressure the paper was torn, and underneath, in wobbly letters, was her name, Carys. She told herself it was a prank, that the owner's grandchildren must have left it. But the pantry door locked from the outside, and she had the only key, and the drawing was done on the back of a receipt dated 3 days ago. More drawings followed under her pillow, inside her paint box, folded into the pocket of her raincoat, each one depicting the same yellow-haired figure in progressively more disturbing scenes. Floating face down in a tide pool, tangled in kelp, being pulled into a dark crack in the seabed by dozens of small, pale hands. The art was getting better, the lines more confident, the details more specific. And one night she woke to the sound of scratching and found a fresh drawing in progress on the bedroom wall, plaster being etched into by something unseen. The figure this time, shown inside the cottage, standing in a room Carys didn't recognize. A room that was all stone and dripping salt water, and filled with children's drawings plastered to the walls. She followed the scratching to the back wall of the cottage, the one that was solid cliff. Pressing her ear to the rock, she heard what sounded like a child humming, a tuneless little melody that was almost swallowed by the sound of waves, and then a whisper, thin and wet. "You found us. Now you can stay." Carys fetched a hammer and chisel from the shed, working at the seam between the wall and the rock, with a desperation that felt older than herself. And after an hour, the stone crumbled away to reveal a narrow gap, just wide enough to squeeze through. And beyond it, a room that shouldn't have been there, a low-ceilinged chamber carved out of the cliff. Its walls covered in hundreds of drawings, some so old they'd fused with the salt into a kind of papery skin. And in the center, a shallow pool of black seawater that breathed in and out with the tide, as if the room had a heartbeat. The drawings were all of children, dozens of them, over what must have been centuries, and every single one showed a child standing on the cliff's edge, arms out, the same wave curling, the same blue dot eyes, and at the bottom of each drawing was a name and a date. The earliest from 1847, the newest from 3 weeks ago, and the newest name was Carys Llewellyn. With today's date written in wet red crayon, she backed away, the salt crunching under her feet, and the humming grew louder, filling the chamber. And the pool rippled, and a small, pale hand broke the surface, followed by another. And another, dozens of them reaching for her, and the whisper came again, this time in a chorus of tiny voices. "The sea keeps us, and we keep the sea, and now you'll keep us company." Carys ran, squeezing back through the gap, and she didn't stop running until she was in her car. cottage, a dark shape in the rear view. The cliff face looking, for just a moment, like a face with a mouth full of salt teeth. She drove to Helston and checked into a B&B. And in the morning, she found a new drawing on the back of her hand. A faint red-ink sketch of a wave curling over a stick figure with yellow hair. And the skin where the drawing sat was cold and wet and smelled of the sea. She's moved 3 times since then, and the drawings still appear under her door in her mail. Once on the mirror of a public toilet in Truro, and she stopped trying to scrub them away, because the last time she did, the whisper came out of her own mouth, and she realized that the room had never let her leave, that some part of her was still in that salty dark, still standing at the cliff's edge, still waiting for the wave to take her. Carys told me all of this in a cafe near Falmouth, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she didn't drink. And when she left, I saw the back of her neck where a tiny stick figure was scratched into the skin, and it was waving at me. And there it is. 3 stories, 3 lives that crossed into a kind of terror most of us pray we'll never meet. Ellis still hears his brother's voice in every river he passes. Tilly and Darcy still feel the Nullarbor pulling at them like a road that never ended. And Carys is still drawing, whether she wants to or not. These aren't just tales. They're a reminder that our world is full of thin places where the rules bend and the dark waits. If you felt a chill, if your skin is still prickling, then you know why I do this. True horror is out there, and the more we share, the less alone we are in the dark. Tell me in the comments which story you'd never survive. And if you've had a real encounter of your own, drop it below. Your experience might be the next one I tell. Hit like, subscribe with all bells, and let's keep listening to the whispers. Until next time, stay away from empty roads, quiet rivers, and old cottages by the sea. The silence is never as empty as it seems.